Team at Palo Alto Networks. I am wearing the white lab coat. If you're wondering why the heck is this guy wearing a white cooking coat up on stage, I am Dr. Drive-By. So I'll be playing the white hat good guy. And to my right here?
My name is Erik Younghans. I'm a consulting engineer for the newly formed security operations team here at Palo Alto Networks. Worked here for the last 4 years. During all of our presentations, John and I, we've done in the past at all Ignites, I play the bad guy. So I'll be basically walking you guys through some typical attack scenarios, as well as John helping with some of the best practices prevention aspects.
Hey, are we going to start out with the all-important selfie before we get started?
If you want to, John.
Absolutely. We do need crowd participation, though. Maybe turn up the house lights a little, and let's have everyone really excited and up and
it's a tradition for us.
Making some noise here. Come on. Yeah, there we go. 1, 2, 3. Cool. Thank you very much. All right. So in this section, we're gonna try and discuss some of the security threats and ensure best practices. So the latest attack techniques. So kind of building on what Karen talked about this morning and Lee, but really how to mitigate them with the full platform. You've got a lot of powerful capability with the Palo Alto Networks platform, and we want to make sure you're leveraging every bit of it. But best practices are one of the things. Quick show of hands, how many of you are leveraging all of our best practices today? Yeah, okay, exactly what we thought. So that's why you're here at Ignite. Ignite, there's so much really good content here, and that's what you want to really take advantage of. We've built so many resources. But one of the benefits is there consistent visibility and consistent prevention. One of our favorite words is prevention.
Absolutely.
What's your favorite word?
Prevention.
Yeah, exactly. But before we get started, we are excited that Lee and Renee allowed us to be able to announce a new product today. So building on the success of our photography-themed products, we have autofocus, we have aperture, and we have magnifier. I'm excited to announce, are you guys ready? We have histogram. Where's the applause? Yeah, there we go. And look at this. This is on the wire, artificial intelligence, machine learning. This takes care of the layer 8 problem. You guys know what layer 8 is? Those are the end users that click on stuff all the time, and you're like, oh, why did they click on that stuff? Now I'm going to have a really bad day. And so this is blockchain-based.
Yeah, of course.
I am playing buzzword bingo, so we have every cool word. That's going to get us the greatest amount of hits there, right?
Now, John, for any new product, of course, before we even actually start creating the product, what do you need?
I think I need a website.
Need marketing and a website. Come on.
Well, let's put together a website.
All right, let's do it.
Could you guys flip over to the video? We're gonna quickly put together a video here.
Now, I think to be smart on this, we're going to go around IT. I don't see any really reason to start.
I'm the marketing. Let's pretend I'm the marketing guy. Let's put together a campaign. So let's quickly go grab a image, put together maybe Drupal out of the AWS store. Again, I could have gone to AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. I like that instant up and going. So I'm grabbing an image here for Drupal, and I love this. Stable and production ready with long-term support and updates. What else does anyone need? A marketing guy getting his system up and going. So I'm going to put it together. Let us launch through EC2. Couple steps and put it up, and I've got the default rules here. Configure the security group with inbound rules and outbound rules.
Now, I was a little bit smarter, so I know that the security groups really only apply inbound. So I made a strict security group just for you, okay? So instead of us just allowing port 80 and port 443 inbound, I also did a strict outbound policy rule, which only allows port 80 and port 443 outbound as well.
That sounds good.
Make sense?
Let's configure that.
All right, pretty straightforward. You guys are probably all familiar with this AWS. I'm basically just going through the process of creating an actual instance, spin it up, assign my key pair, and we're good to go.
So it's just about up and going. Let's enable the detailed monitoring with CloudWatch. And so that way we've got our Drupal image. There's my username and password. So now all I need to do is set up and add some content. So let's go ahead and take the histogram information. Let's put it together. And I have the histogram website completely with the Silicon Valley conjoined triangles of success. So this product is going to be absolutely fantastic. Everyone, round of applause. Histogram is now real and live. Thank you, thank you.
Very exciting. Now, John, I hate to be the breaker of bad news for you.
What? I have my website, I have my product, don't ruin my parade here.
Yeah, I kind of pulled just a couple little tools off the web just to see if I could figure out potentially that long-term stable support Drupal instance you stood up.
It's long-term stable support. This thing's fantastic.
Yeah, unfortunately, not so much.
So what is this tool you're using?
So basically, it's going to identify, one, the versioning that's installed on the Drupal site.
Okay.
Once I've identified the version, because of course the configuration actually left behind the trails of what version was installed,
All right.
that's going to see if it's actually vulnerable right out of the box from AWS to Drupal Get into.
So what's the tool called?
So this is Drupone.
Nice.
If you guys are familiar,
I
very
like
similar
these.
to-
Who likes ASCII art? That's one of my favorite parts there.
Of course. So
And-
if you didn't see this for a second there, once I identified the version, which is version 8.3, even though I spun up the AWS instance on demand for the actual presentation, it was actually pulling and using an outdated version of Drupal by default. And in fact, if you still go and find that instance now in the AWS Marketplace and spin it up today, you will also get the vulnerable instance of Drupal.
Now
right out of
again,
the box.
we are not particularly picking on AWS. Any of the cloud pre-ready images, that's one of the challenges that you have as it's stable and production ready. There may be stable and production ready with extra tools. This is Metasploit that's popping up here that you saw Karen talk about earlier, just one of the simple tools. I'll let you.
Yeah, so I'm basically just spinning this up and basically using this as my platform for injecting myself into the website. We stopped and paused on the login screen for a moment there, because that is actually the vulnerable aspect of Drupal in this instance. So basically what I'm going to do is inject myself into the website. I'm going to be a bit smart about this, so instead of me just kind of dropping myself to disk in some way, I'm going to inject myself into memory. So instead of creating a file locally on the actual device itself, again, I'm injecting myself into memory, which you can see here. The long string of base64 decoded information, that's my injection into the actual website itself. Funny enough, the way this actual instance is configured, I'm actually running as the EC2 user. So the mistake was made, actually the beginning of this actual AWS Marketplace image, to allow me to then sudo right into root. So literally, I can drop myself right into root into that system, gather all the information about the underlying OS, as well as the actual CPU, memory architecture, et cetera. And at the same time, what you see here is the keys of the kingdom. I actually copied out the opposite side of the keychain for the SSH key pair.
Okay, translating the technical terms.
Basically, this is everything that you access within AWS is tied to this key pair, and I just copied at least half of the conversation.
So you can.
I can also log into other instances that include this SSH key pair, but also I can modify this and force you to log in with the other side of the conversation.
This is definitely not good.
Yeah, definitely not good. Let's get back to the presentation itself.
Okay. So the lawyers did ask us to make a disclaimer. Unfortunately, this is not a real Palo Alto Networks product, but if you were excited about it, please tell Renee and Lee that you want us to pursue the product. So anyway, disclaimer there, that's not a real product. So let's get into the presentation there. So the challenges you have every day. The threat landscape continues to change. Every day it's something new. And so if you put together your strategy and your protection ideas 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, they're probably very much outdated. Everything is something new. And so especially as you go into private cloud and public cloud, it's moving and accelerating even faster. So that's one of the things that you want to do is stay on top of all the latest changes so you can understand where things are going. Limited visibility. What's actually running as your environment is up and going? So Erik, when you did that attack, how many logs were actually generated with that attack?
That was about 0 logs.
So
fortunately, all you have is the actual incoming firewall logs from the security group saying that there was an actual attempt to access port 80 in this context. And to be very specific here, on the security group going outbound, because I allowed port 443, the traffic I generated to communicate between the web server was not actual SSL traffic.
Yeah.
So that was a interpreter configuration that I said that ignore SSL, just use port 443 as my conduit for communication.
Yeah, a lot of times we'll find customers are alerting instead of preventing. We want to get you to a prevention-based posture. Alerting is a great initial step, but being able to stop as many of these attacks, especially, as Karen talked about, attackers are using automated tools. You need to be able to stop as many of them as possible and be able to get the upper hand and stay ahead of the curve. We talked about that layer 8 problem. Misconfiguration and human error. That's one of the natural things that's going to occur. And again, if I have a server on the internal where I've misconfigured it, it's probably not as big an issue. If I have my cloud deployed or publicly facing system and it's misconfigured, what happens then?
You get owned.
Yeah. And again, it's public to the world, exposing a lot of PII and potentially compromising information. A lot of times we'll hear, availability over security. Oh, I don't want to block things. I want to make sure it's always up and going. And so customers are doing more availability instead of security. But again, you really need both. So we want to help you to optimize as much as possible, putting those things together. And really, one of the things, what do we not want? We don't want job-seeking moments. What are those job-seeking moments?
When your database gets leaked to the internet, or when your SSH keys are now compromised for all of your AWS instances.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the small things, talking about, we are in EMEA, so talking about GDPR. If you haven't taken the steps to properly secure it, then there's additional penalties and things like that, but I am not a lawyer, I'm not a GDPR expert. Please go to the GDPR sessions, and Paolo is doing a fantastic session on there. So the main thing there is, are you securing your data center, private cloud, public cloud, and internet gateway properly? That's what we're going to be covering today. There's going to be a lot of best practices. Please take advantage of all the sessions right after us. So Mandeep and Arun are going to be covering the internet gateway best practices as well. There's also in the Expo Hall, we have a variety of different tables set up as well, so you can find out about threat prevention, you can find out about magnifier, autofocus, the firewall rules, App ID, all the cool things. One thing to remember, though, with the best practices, these are guidelines. Every one of you is really different as a customer. Every deployment is different, and that's one of the things. There really is no easy button. You're going to need to go through these. And so we don't want you to come back, after Ignite. Well, John and Erik told me to go enable this, enable this, enable this, and things fall over. Walk slowly and make sure you know what and why you're doing. And that's one of the things that we wanted to give you a little context of why these best practices are really so important. Okay? Anything else to add on that?
Nope. All good.
Great. So as Lee talked about this morning, this is one of my absolute favorite slides. To do prevention, you need to do all of this stuff. And so complete visibility, reducing the attack surface, prevent known threats, known threats and then unknown threats. Every one of these things, you want to maximize your opportunities to stop the threats as much as possible. Okay, quick show of hands. How many of you are doing SSL decryption today?
Oh, okay. That's a pretty good amount.
Okay.
I mean, it's fair.
That's a good start. Quick show of hands. How many of you are leveraging the file blocking profile today? Okay. Again, still not enough. That's a good start. Next year at Ignite, when we asked the same thing, we want the entire room to go, yes, we're all doing this. So this is one of the things that leverage as much as possible. So if you're not doing SSL decryption, there's a number of the attacks that we're going to show you that are being missing. There's a number of things around App ID. So App ID is an essential part of the visibility part of what you're allowing in and what you're allowing out. So we're going to go into details as we go into this. So the big thing for this session is really, how do adversaries get in? So we wanted to give you a little context of, are they parachuting in? Are they coming through the left side? Are they putting a Trojan horse and coming through the front doors? As Karen talked about this morning, the more you can learn about the adversaries and what they're doing, and Ryan Olson talked about that as well, right? Two fantastic resources for you is Fantastic Learning Every Day, is the Unit 42 blog post. The threat research coming out of our Unit 42, which Ryan Olson talked about this morning, is absolutely phenomenal. A lot of these attacks we're going to talk about came from there, came from our teams, and then the attack playbooks. And so you can really start to operationalize some of the tactics and procedures that the adversaries are doing, so you know the controls you need to actually put in place within your network to be able to mitigate these. All right, so let's get into the threat landscape. So exploit kits are one of the key things that are being used to drop malware and payloads on your network. And so just real quick, what an exploit kit is are automated tools that will silently infect you. A user goes to visit a website. The website senses what the user is vulnerable to. Ah, you're vulnerable to Internet Explorer. Oh, you're running Adobe Flash. I'm really sorry to hear that. You're going to be exploited. Anyone here still running Java? Okay, hopefully not. But again, the exploit kits sense what you're running on the client side. They then exploit that vulnerability, and then it's like a tube. Anything they want to download down to the endpoint can be downloaded, from ransomware to malware to remote access Trojans, things like that. They've changed quite a bit. Angler last year, we announced it died, but this year it's really, they've changed. Instead of being mass scale, infect as many people, they're more focused. And so we see Fallout, Rig, we see Magnitude and Grandsoft. And that's one of the things that still is out there and dropping malicious payloads.
Yeah, in the context here, if you think about an exploit kit and the way it's designed for mass infection. So the reality is, whatever malware is slid into the exploit kit is basically what's going to be delivered to the world. And a lot of them are very well advanced. We've done some demonstrations in the past at previous Ignite conferences, talking about exactly how they can identify where you are geographically and decide to deliver different payloads depending on where you are. So it's a really good understanding from the attacker's perspective is what the situational awareness they have of your basically customers and your own employees.
Yeah, I mean, the employees don't have to do anything. It's the normal stuff you all are doing every single day. And if you don't have mitigations when your user visits a website and is silently infected, then you need to ensure you have the right protection. So one of the payloads that's frequently dropped with exploit kits is ransomware. And one of the things that we saw last year is ransomware was just all the rage. And so it's declined quite a bit, but it's still very much a serious threat. So we have an update from Europol talking about ransomware being a threat. Real quick show of hands, and feel free to raise. How many of you have seen ransomware infections in your environment? Okay, so I've got a really bad joke, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is one good benefit of ransomware, and that's you know you have a problem. And so the same infection techniques that can drop ransomware can also drop a remote access Trojan or any malware, and you have no idea that you have an infection.
Even to add to that, it's kind of funny when you think about ransomware being so noisy. You see that. You know what's happening in your environment. When it's something stealthy like TrickBot or Emotet or some of the banking Trojans, which are designed to not be detected, it's usually by the time you find out, it's way too late. Your information is gone, your login credentials have been stolen, et cetera. So in some ways, it's to your point earlier, it's actually good to actually have a ransomware infection at some point in your environment so you know what your weak spots are.
Yeah, it is. And so one of the things that's really changed, instead of going after the individual users, they're going after more of the soft targets. Maybe targeting hospitals or public sector environments, lawyers' offices, doctors' offices, and securing and encrypting and holding ransom an entire group of servers, especially as you get into cloud environments. Let's take the entire database and encrypt it and take that hostage, or entire city and some of the public transport around there. I think one of the things, and Karen mentioned this earlier, that's really made it also a little more nasty is the Eternal Blue SMB vulnerability last year that tied on with WannaCry. So not only do you have an infection on one system, but now you have it spreading laterally, infecting multiple systems, holding multiple systems for ransom.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is everyone remembers from WannaCry last year, there was actually a mention of a kill switch, that one guy registered a domain and actually cut off WannaCry from encrypting actual devices. What's interesting is after that was published, there was actually newer iterations of WannaCry that did not require any C2 communication for the ransomware or their ransom encryption process to take place. So instead of requiring some of outbound communication, it can move laterally and jump between people, but did not require any outbound communication in any way whatsoever to actually fully encrypt a device. So if you guys are around in the afternoon, I'll be at the autofocus booth later. Please stop by. We can delve a bit deeper into that, and you can see the shift after security researchers had published some research on WannaCry. And WannaCry is still obviously a pretty serious threat and still passing around in most environments, let's say in the internet as a whole today.
Yeah, the cool thing was we used autofocus to actually show the statistics of how things are changing in the file types. And that's one of the things for using the threat intelligence out of autofocus, to have a real-time view into how the file types, whether it's PE files or Office documents, things like that. But let's go ahead and show a recent ransomware example.
Yeah, so actually, in the process of getting ready for this presentation a couple weeks ago, we decided to pull out a more recent sample of GanCrab, which is a pretty prevalent ransomware family still being delivered around the world, and show you exactly how this works. So when you look at this process, understand this is typically an email delivery of typically a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet with a macro enabled inside of the actual spreadsheet itself. And we're going to show you what the internal side of the document looks like that the user received. So user opens Word document. User is coached by social engineering to enable the macros inside the document.
Hey, I would never enable macros, right? Okay.
Yeah, funny how it's mentioning Windows Defender here to kind of give you this idea, a false sense of security, that it's a Microsoft-enabled or security document. Oh, yeah.
Pause it there.
Sorry. Oh, geez. Skipped too fast. what's interesting about this, if you look at this process, so let me skip back a little bit. So what took place in this moment? So when the user clicked enable macros, the macro or basically called the PowerShell. PowerShell called out to an external resource, an external URL, which in this case, it sets up an array of 4 or 5 different URLs to pull from. It ingests a binary, and the binary is executed. To the user, they see nothing until, if you notice at a point here, the actual word closes. The malware itself forces the closure of Word to actually encrypt all the files locally on the drive. So whatever document, even that was inside of Word, actually is encrypted at the same time. This entire process took place. You can see here, this is a very short amount of time. I don't have very many documents on this actual sandbox. So basically, the time frame was about 2 to 3 minutes for this entire process to play out. So I wanted to show this as an example, because if you start looking at traps as an endpoint agent, we have some really unique capabilities. So what I actually did here, use the same exact document, but what I did do is actually disable a bunch of the profiles that enable wildfire lookups or any other pre-detection mechanism we have inside of traps, because I really want to focus on this one feature. So in this context, again, Word document executed macro. We have traps identified malicious activity. Now what took place here, after the secondary payload came into the system, which came from, again, either a compromised URL or a hosting site, when that execution took place, traps identified the binary that was attempting to encrypt the files and stopped it based upon the behavior of the binary. So you see here, I zoomed in, you see the anti-ransomware protection module that was enabled. Basically, that was the last vestige of resort, so to speak, for that entire process to play out. The trap stopped. So it's a good example when you talk about an endpoint agent having this capability of identifying the true behavior of a sample itself, ignoring sandboxing, ignoring all these other things, how you can literally stop even lateral movement or lateral jumping of binaries between users.
Yeah, so if we actually looked at just some of the best practices, I hate to say one of the things is end user education about not enabling macros and documents. And that's one of the things, hey, if there's only one person that you can keep from being that layer 8 problem of the day and clicking on that and encrypting their system, then that's a good thing. Continue to, the end user education, continue to try it. But then Erik was talking about if I had a wildfire enabled, wildfire would have done the analysis on there. If in opening the document, it had actually exploited a vulnerability, then traps would have prevented the vulnerability from being exploited in the first place. And in this case, there's multiple ransomware modules that'll kick in.
Yeah, in the context here, again, this is now a known binary performing ransomware activity. This is communicated to all of the endpoints worldwide. Not only your own environment, but every single other endpoint within the Palo Alto Networks platform. So basically, at this point, this is a known bad binary stopped across the entire world. So and just because of one user's behavior.
Yeah, so if one user's behavior, you're telling me that in one country, it's now protected all the way across the world.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So again, that's kind of the power of the Palo Alto Networks platform. That's one of the reasons why you want Wildfire. You want also the traps module and some of the other things that we're going to talk about here. So let's switch back over to the presentation and just do a quick review. So the first thing there is, all these things, but we talked about decrypting traffic. And so that's one of the things that, quick show of hands, LinkedIn. How many of you use LinkedIn today for your professional contacts? And is it your personal or professional email? Does it go to your personal email box? Yeah, a lot of times it's going to your personal email. So if you're sitting there checking email and all of a sudden you get a LinkedIn request from someone, hey, I was at this security conference. Here's a great Word doc. Would you mind taking a look and reading it? That's one of the reasons why decrypting employee webmail is absolutely essential, because all of a sudden you have all these protections in place, but you're not doing SSL decryption, and it just blows right on through. And I think Arun is, this afternoon, right after our session, is going to talk about even more sessions for even more reasons for doing SSL decryption. Blocking risky file types, also combining blocking risky URL categories, also the ability to block URL, doing file blocking and URL filtering. This is one of the things that we see with ransomware or with exploit kits. Exploit kits are an interesting thing. If you use autofocus, you can actually see a lot of times the exploit kits are delivered from flash vulnerabilities delivered out of Russia. So from an uncategorized URL. So from a business standpoint, you could say, I don't want to have flash files, or for that matter, PE files delivered from uncategorized URLs from countries I don't necessarily do business every day with.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples for risky file types, Screensavers. If a screensaver on a Windows system, if you double-click on a screensaver, a .scr file, it runs just like any other application on it, and it's an executable. So there's a great reason that people in accounts payable should never, never, ever need to have a screensaver coming from the outside coming in. And we're going to have some other examples of using the file type blocking. But again, exploit kits and ransomware are really easy if you keep doing these things. On the IPS, the vulnerability side, we actually just did an emergency content release yesterday, and then we also did one Friday night at 7 o'clock. So the Fallout exploit kit was the one on Friday, and then generic exploit kit last night. And so making sure you have a vulnerability profile to block the exploit kits, because our Unit 42 threat research team is absolutely fantastic at stopping the exploit kits that are delivering a lot of these payloads. Make sure you have an AV profile set up to block known malware that's out there. And then the last thing, we had just talked about, Wildfire to turn the unknown into known, so that if Wildfire had looked at that one Word doc, it would have taken that one, if that had never been seen anywhere in the world, it would have said, oh, I know this is malicious now, it is now known, and we'll block that with AV around the world. And then the last thing, we showed traps right there. There's one other cool best practice. Make sure you take a look at how frequently you're checking for new applications and threats updates. Again, I mentioned the exploit kit emergency content update we did yesterday, as well as Friday night at 7 o'clock. None of you are necessarily sitting around the office, and that's where you can leverage the automation to have the updates as frequently as possible to make sure you're consuming all the latest content that we have. And then with PanOS 8.1, we also enabled you to have different thresholds for different app ID updates from the threat prevention updates. And Mandeep will talk more, or at the expo hall after that. So any ideas why the decline in ransomware? Any guesses?
The slide should say it all.
It's Bitcoin.
As Bitcoin rose, obviously ransomware infections rose as well, and as Bitcoin fell, and is still falling to this day, the decline in ransomware has taken place as well.
But when we saw this slide, that really gave us a really good idea. And so unfortunately, today is Erik and I's last day. We are actually leaving Palo Alto Networks, and I am going Bitcoin mining full-time now.
We'll take our histogram product and move it into the world as being blockchain.
Bitcoin's where it's at. Anyone else want to join?
Yeah. The only problem is, John, as you saw, as Bitcoin's price has fallen, and honestly, unless you've invested heavily in GPUs sitting in your basement with lots of coolant,
oh, come on.
You're not going to be making too much profit.
So wait, where's the money now?
The money now is all in CPU mining.
Oh, I don't know about
Familiar with Monero and these other cryptocurrencies?
Oh, wait, you've got a nice shirt there, so.
Yeah, get rich or die mining, this is also kind of dead too, even though I've got my nice GPU here. But this is kind of an interesting point. If you think about the transition from ransomware to crypto mining, basically it kind of follows the price point of Bitcoin falling. Because the reality is ransomware as a whole has been very, very noisy. You know what's happening. You know what's taking place in the environment, and you take a action based upon it, whether you pay the ransom or you decide not to pay the ransom. If you think about crypto mining as the opposite side of the coin, crypto mining typically is very silent. Typically, you don't know about it until some aspect of your network either reports to you that something is taking place, or a user complains, or you see abnormal CPU utilization on the actual server and or clients themselves.
Yeah, I mean, being able to take advantage of your resources and being able to make money off of your resources is really the game, rather than targeting individual users. It's a good way to make money. And so these are some of the latest headlines we've seen. The Cyber Threat Alliance that we're part of, so we actually took a chart from there. They reported a 459% increase in crypto mining. So it's really just changed substantially over the last year.
And what's interesting about this is most of the tools that are being delivered to users are basically open source tools designed for crypto mining in general. Typically, they're going to have a configuration, so basically a past variable that says, basically mine cryptocurrency and deliver to this wallet. Now think about that in the context of your environment. You come across it, there's no way for you to trace back what that wallet is, who it belongs to, or how much has actually typically been generated in the context of Monero. So it's a very easy deployable method for an adversary where there's literally no recourse on your end. There's nothing you can do.
So tell me a little bit about the different type of crypto miners.
Yes.
And
this guy looks very happy.
This guy looks way too happy.
He's got his IKEA lamp. He's got his bike in the back.
Surfing the web, everything's fine, except the fan on my machine is like totally working on overtime.
Yeah, so when you see the CPU jump when he goes to one particular website, this is a really good example. So if everyone's familiar with this, CoinHive was kind of the originator of this idea. CoinHive is a JavaScript you can actually insert into any website. It will actually generate cryptocurrency as the browser sits on that URL. To go 2 slides back, John had shown a little blob of information about UNICEF in Australia. You can go find this today. If you go search for UNICEF Australia cryptocurrency, you'll find a website where you can go to and click Start, and it will generate cryptocurrency and deliver the output directly to UNICEF for a donation. Now, take the flip side of that and put this on any site that you compromise and or sites that you've built just for this purpose. Basically, now you've got an army of people visiting URLs that are basically generating cryptocurrency on demand for you.
Hey, wait, maybe I should put my lab coat on, because that sounds like drive-by mining, Dr. Drive-by. Okay, sorry.
If you go on Google and do a little bit of, not heavy searching, you can see this later actually at the autofocus booth, you'll find different URLs that have had some type of compromisation, either through SQL injection or something similar to that, where they've injected the CoinHive script into the actual code of the website. So I found one earlier this morning. It's actually a shopping cart link where you go through the checkout process. In that checkout process, it will actually mine cryptocurrency as you go through the entire process.
So I guess there's some websites that are doing that because they have fallen ad revenue. They're like, we're going to make money by you visiting us. So that's one way. But then there's other guys, the adversaries have taken over your website and decided to mine on your behalf.
Yeah, I'll give you a kind of an interesting situation I saw at one of our customer sites. We were in the process of doing a POC. We kept seeing, we actually have a vulnerability protection for CoinHive, the JavaScript itself. So it can identify when someone hits a URL that includes this JavaScript. So we kept seeing repetitively one person with about 17 different hits, or 17 to 20 or so, different hits per day on the CoinHive JavaScript. And we kind of went to the incident response guys. We're like, it seems really random that this one person is actually responsible for this large number of IPS vulnerability triggers. It turned out that person, when they would come in the morning, would log into multiple machines and basically start cryptocurrency mining while they did their work. So it's basically using the CPU resources of what he had available to him inside the environment to basically mine cryptocurrency on the back end for himself. So all the money was being delivered to his own wallet.
But I think there's even an even better way to earn more money, right?
Yes.
Let's go for the all your server are belong to us.
Because the reality is, if I'm going to be a small guy and use CPU mining from a browser, it's not going to net me very much. When I combine this with exploits in a larger context and hopefully compromising larger resources, then I have more of a pool of information or more of a pool of resources to be able to generate money for myself.
And where are the big pools sitting?
They're in AWS, they're in Azure, they're in your data center.
Yeah, so whether it's private cloud, public cloud, or your server farms inside your enterprise, that's a lot of free compute resources, or free compute resources from the adversary's perspective. So anything else to add on that? So I think a lot of the coin mining really starts with, and a lot of the server attacks start with vulnerabilities. So in previous years, we've talked a lot about client-side attacks, the exploit kits, ransomware, things like that. So we wanted to take this time to really talk about server-side attacks. So let's talk first vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are the bugs in the applications and software in your environment. And so that's one of the changes in the threat landscape. Just last year, 128% increase in the number of vulnerabilities being in 2017. 2018 is already looking like it's definitely going to surpass that as well. So that's really one of the key things that continues to change. The Palo Alto Networks threat research team is also uncovering vulnerabilities. Does anyone know what today is also? What famous vulnerability day is it today? Ooh. Patch Tuesday, second Tuesday of every month. We love that. So Microsoft vulnerabilities, Adobe vulnerabilities. So there's probably going to be a whole lot more vulnerabilities. Check your emails later today. But the Palo Alto Networks threat research team is building the mitigations. In fact, they're actually discovering vulnerabilities and have discovered more than 220 vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer, Adobe Flash, and Adobe Reader. We were excited to have some of our, we have 4 of the top 100 researchers highlighted at Microsoft, by Microsoft team at the MSRC at Black Hat this summer. So excited to have 4 of the top researchers. One of my threat researchers is one of the top 10 researchers who's a female on the team who's just absolutely amazing. So, we're really making sure we're covering and discovering vulnerabilities, fairly disclosing them to Adobe and Microsoft, and other vulnerabilities as well, but then also making sure we're delivering the vulnerability protection. So there's a great vulnerability. Why don't we talk a little bit about?
Yeah, so this is the beginning of the presentation. We showed the video of compromising that single AWS instance. This is the perfect storm, so to speak, from a vulnerability perspective as to what its capabilities are. So this Drupal Get 2 vulnerability was a version 8 like 2 and below, and then version 7 to 7.5. So basically, when Drupal came out and said, we have published this vulnerability, and we'll get into little details of that in a moment, but they basically stated outright that every single Drupal instance, for the most part in the world, was vulnerable to this specific CVE. Now, in the context of this CVSS score, this is extremely high. It's a remote code execution, network accessible, no authentication. So the reality is, if I want to trigger this vulnerability, as I did within the AWS instance, it required no authentication, no login information. It was actually done through the login page that you saw, those two fields.
So when we did that website, that username and password, that was it, huh?
Yeah, so just the mere fact of it having a username and password field available was what the vulnerability was able to introduce into the actual environment. What's interesting about that is that because it's a complete remote code execution, I can literally do anything I want on the device with that single actual exploit itself. So we'll show you some examples of this, but let's take a step through the timeline and look at how this was disclosed and how protections were delivered across the world within our platform.
Yeah, so back on March 28th, the Drupal vulnerability was announced. So more than 1 million CMS websites were vulnerable at that time. And so definitely a critical vulnerability. And so we actually delivered our protections on April 13th. The interesting thing is with open source software, normally we can just reverse engineer the patches and figure out, okay, here's how we're going to exploit the vulnerability, here's how we can build protection. But Drupal didn't actually, the team didn't actually patch the vulnerability, they actually sanitized the input, so it took us a little bit longer. But the good news is the exploitation of that vulnerability didn't start happening until April 18th. So you had a lot of protection and time in place if you were deploying your threat prevention updates and had it configured as quickly as possible. But of course, once that was out there, there's yet another slight tangent to that vulnerability, the CVE 2018-7602 that came out. And again, this time was much shorter between when we had the vulnerability signature and when the exploitation started happening. So it's really that time between vulnerability announcement and exploitation continues to change. Every vulnerability is totally different. So the more that, my team is the one that's staying on top of that to make sure we're delivering the protections as quickly as possible. We want to make sure you're consuming that and getting the protections deployed out to your environment as quickly as possible.
And that's a great example of the shortened time window. Look at the beginning, where you see the first initial vulnerability being basically published, to exploitation, worldwide exploitation, then to the actual even reduced time frame at the very end with a second vulnerability. So your window of time, if you're waiting like every quarter or every month, let's say, to do a patch and or to apply vulnerability signatures, that's your window of time that you've basically exposed yourself.
Yeah. So what did we do?
So we decided, what if we just spin up a resource, unadvertised, and just collect information? So basically here what I did is I spun up a Drupal 8 instance that was completely vulnerable. Not in AWS, actually. I used it at my home, so a Comcast cable account. No other information available, just literally spun it up and let it sit. So what's interesting here, this is a map of every single request incoming to that resource over a 2-week period that included the vulnerability trigger. So basically meaning someone scanning, looking to see if I had a vulnerable Drupal instance in this case, and actually passing the actual exploit to my system.
So again, an example of just automated tools.
Yeah, automated tools scanning the open inert, looking for basically vulnerable systems. What's not easy to see in this map, they're not scaled to the actual number of requests I got. A lot of concentration in Asia, as you would expect. But in the United States, which you see regionally, there's California, Midwest, and then East Coast. Those are actually other AWS instances that were actually scanning my device and looking to actually use that for an exploitation attempt.
Yikes.
So it wasn't so much like they were just random people, using just random resources. These were literally AWS instances that were actually attacking my network infrastructure.
Well, are there some other examples that we can kind of go into? Let's go a little bit more into live site.
So in that 2-week period, we let a couple of life cycles play out. And we're going to demonstrate those life cycles to you today to help you understand exactly from the context of the adversary what not only their motivation was in some cases, but also what their capabilities were during the actual full life cycle process. So this is actually the first one, and a really good example. We're going to start building upon this. So think about this as the adversary triggers the vulnerability, so performs the exploitation attempt, actually is able to trigger the vulnerability correctly. They use the base OS function, either curl or wget, wget in this case, to pull in a file from a pre-compromised Grecian travel website. So that ioletravel.gr was actually another Joomla instance they had compromised.
So wait, why is my website going to a travel web?
Very good question. There should be no reason why your actual server is initiating an outbound request to an external website.
And then it's going to...
Yeah, so it's going to pull in a dot or one.txt. One.txt is actually a PHP file. So when that one.txt actually translates into a PHP file locally and is executed, it will then call out to two pastebin links. And I'll give someone a guess here. Can you guess what these two pastebin links are? They are actually the patch for the vulnerability.
Oh, that was awfully nice of them.
Yeah, so basically once the adversary triggers the vulnerability, delivers the PHP code, executes the PHP code, it will then call out, grab the two patches, apply the patches locally on the system, so that way no one else can gain access to the resource, and then does something very, very unique, but I'll show you in the video.
So they exploit it, own it, patch it so no one else can get in. That's awfully nice of them.
Exactly right, exactly right. So let's step over to the video demonstration, and I'll walk you through how this is set up. So basically, I mimicked the exact behavior. So within Metasploit, basically performed the exploitation, delivered the one.txt, which changes into the PHP code at the actual dropping level. What's interesting about AWS in this context, because I use wget, it doesn't have any certificate chains, so I just told wget to ignore certificates. So I'm using SSL to communicate with the compromised site on my side to pull in the file. In this, right now, you see the PHP cur.php. When I execute this, you see that small little snippet of code that says JYPB. So to be very blunt here, what JYPB is, it is actually a secret key. It's generated on demand only once and randomized. And the reason why that is when you actually see me do this very specific command with that actual little small snippet of code, it then gives me a backdoor. So the backdoor is actually the ability of me uploading content to the site itself. And in my context, since I'm an old school guy, my parents used to take me to go buy 2600 Hacker Quarterly magazine at Barnes & Noble. I inserted a JPEG basically the background of this website. So it basically gives you that capability, again, of just flipping the code enough so I'm actually patching the vulnerability, and then giving me a backdoor to allow me to upload anything I want to the actual URL, as long as I know that secret code.
So is everyone's mind kind of spinning right now, going, this does not sound like standard behavior that my website should be doing, right? That's hopefully what's going through there. There's a number of things, and we'll kind of review that in just a minute. Let's switch back over to the slides, please. So one of the key things here, as I'm talking to customers, it's really the understanding of cloud security is your responsibility. There's part of the global infrastructure that's their responsibility. And again, whether this is AWS, whether this is Azure, whether this is Google Cloud, this is one of the key things. You need to bring the security. If there's one thing you walk away from this week at Ignite, it's really understanding this. That constant visibility, the constant, the same visibility between your internet gateway and your private cloud and public cloud and data center. You want to have that consistent visibility. You want to have the consistent prevention ability and be able to secure the platform, applications, access control, the operating system, networking, and security.
Absolutely. So what we want to do is actually show you in a video again of the best practices of how we would apply this for just that single instance. So that single attack workflow I showed you, of basically triggering the vulnerability to actually using wget to call out to an external website and actually pull in a file and then do the execution. So this video is really built around the idea that if we were to apply inbound policy rules that specify, obviously I allow external access to my Drupal instance. I'm going to specify what application. So thusly, if you're trying to use something else to communicate this URL, this actual site, it's going to be dropped anyway. At the same time, we're going to apply very, very strict inbound security controls. So a strict antivirus profile, a strict anti-spyware profile, a strict vulnerability profile. All these things help protect the actual inbound request to that URL.
And then on the outbound?
Yeah, and the outbound, think about this. What we're showing here is if we allow this external resource, and I would argue you don't necessarily need to even allow external resources to talk, or server resources to talk.
Pause it right there.
Yeah, this is where we start to see where the application ID functionality can be really useful for you. So in this context, we're only allowing apt-get, yum, which are two package manager updates for the underlying Linux OS. But the reality is you could specify the destination. If you have a patch management cycle that only calls to your single internal resource for basically cohesive updates for all of your OSs, this is where you'd point that rule. Not allowing general access to allow these type of tools to actually.
And on the slide before, or on the step before, we actually configured GeoIP. So we said only communicate with IPs in the US and Canada. And I think this is one of the things that, again, in trying to secure this application, you need to have some context about what it is, what it should be doing, and putting that together.
Yeah, and even in the context here, if you think about the original compromisation of that AWS instance, I was able to communicate over port 443, but I was non-SSL traffic. So we talk about in the context of app ID, again, app ID is going to identify this is not SSL traffic and drop the traffic inline. That could actually be the point where you start to realize something may be happening with my server. If your server is unexpectedly generating traffic to unexpected resources for no apparent reason, where it never did that previously, that can actually be a starting point for your investigation to understand maybe this resource has been compromised in some way.
Yeah, and I think one thing is the automated part of this. Whether you're deploying a web server, deploying a mail server, deploying a database, it's understanding the context of what that is, what it should be communicating, from and to, and who should be allowing access to that. Because the more you can restrict both inbound and outbound, again, John Kindervag says it best, zero trust, ensuring you've got the right zero trust posture of what should be allowed.
Yeah, in this context, we're basically making a standard drop all unknowns. So basically what we're doing here is making sure that there's no unknown TCP, no unknown UDP traffic going in or out from any of those resources basically we just set up in the previous rules.
So these are a great example. These are all the vulnerabilities attempted to be exploited. Drupal, the Apache WebLogic vulnerability we've seen in honeypots, and there's some of these or other IoT vulnerabilities, whether it's DVR vulnerabilities, things like that.
Yeah, and this is actually real live logs from the 2 weeks I had this resource up. So this is a good example of what you'll see on a regular basis just by having a general listening device sitting on the internet. What's interesting, you see here in that April timeframe, you see multiple different Drupal exploitation events and multiple different Apache struts and Oracle WebLogic. That was just because those are the vulnerabilities of the day. They were being typically automated by the adversary to try and gain access to different resources.
So you and I were talking a little earlier. So what could you do to automate the attacker IP addresses to be able to add automated protection?
So one of the nice things you guys aren't aware for the auto-tagging feature that was introduced, I believe, in PayOS 8.0, the capability, and we'll show you this in a slide, but take the example. If I trigger multiple different vulnerability events inside of my logs, I could have the auto-tagging feature move the requesting IP, so whoever's generating the actual exploit attempts themselves, and move them into a quarantine group across my entire environment worldwide. So if I have a firewall in AWS, a firewall in Azure, a firewall living on my local data center, once I see 1 or 2 vulnerability attempts from one single IP in one location, I'll immediately start quarantining that offending IP across my entire environment.
Lock known bad IPs, reduce the attack surface.
Exactly.
It doesn't get any simpler. Let's switch back over to the presentation, please. So just to review there, some of the things we talked about is complete visibility, but we started with an inbound app ID rule. We started with an outbound app ID. Block all other apps. Restrict GeoIP. Understand where your systems, who should be allowing access, where it should really be going. And that's one of the things. One of the things was, should your server be allowed to be doing web browser from it? Yeah, I really don't think so. So that's where we talked about even being able to tie for the application updates. So even if you are grabbing something off Pastebin for some God-known reason, it's, you're only doing it within a particular window to a particular site, or even the APT, the YUM updates or the apt-get updates as well.
Yeah, a good example. If you have a patch management strategy that has a monthly patch cycle, let's say, you can deploy the vulnerability signatures in line for blocking the actual exploitation attempts. At the same time, you could schedule within the policy, I allow YUM updates to take place on this particular Friday.
Yeah.
So you can be very laser focused and very specific about how you deploy or how you actually deploy your updates at the same time protecting the resources that can't be patched immediately.
Yeah, generally your servers should not be allowing web browsing from it outbound. So that's a pretty big thing. There's so many things that would have stopped a lot of that attack right there. So why don't we take it another step further then? Let's go.
Yes, we're going to build upon our previous example here.
Yep.
So this is taking it a step further. So we had the original site compromisation or site takeover, which is basically just patching the actual device and then leaving behind a backdoor. This actually then takes it one step further to actually actively crypto mine on the device. So again, same similar trigger. So the exploitation trigger that takes place. That then results in the call to an IP address in the Seychelles for this example, which actually pulled in a script. So you see that c.sh. That is actually a shell script that, when executed, does something very unique. Not only the fact does it actually figure out, let's skip to the next slide, I'll show you this. It actually identifies the actual OS type, the processor type, the memory limits, also identifies other defining information about the actual server itself. It base64 encodes that data, so basically encrypts it with its static key, and then pushes that information out to another resource. So it posts the data externally from the resource it initially infected.
So first my system's grabbing a file from the Seychelles, and grabbing an ELF binary.
Grabbing a shell script first.
Yeah, OK.
Then it performs this operation to figure out what is actually running or what is available in terms of resources to the actual script itself. Then it will call out and actually grab an ELF binary, because it's figured out it's living in Linux, and actually deliver the ELF binary, which is a crypto miner.
Yeah. So it sounds like all things my server should not be doing. You want to do a quick demo?
Yeah, if you notice there at the bottom of the last slide, I want to mention this, and I'll show you in the video itself. There's actually a routine that actually runs, what actually tunes the memory. The reason why it tunes the memory in Linux, it basically gives more memory allocated to the CPU. So thusly, it can use more resources. Thusly, meaning that it can gain more money for the adversary. So this example, what's interesting here, if you notice really quickly, when I pulled the shell script in, I asked the local Amazon instance to use the local Amazon Yum repository to install all the tools I need to build the actual crypto miner locally.
Yikes, thanks.
Yeah, so instead of me going even out of the environment, if you don't know this about AWS, you execute Yum commands on an actual AWS instance, it doesn't even leave your environment. It literally goes to an internal network resource to pull in binaries and deliver it locally. So that entire process, from a log perspective, you would see absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Again, not good stuff. So
I started my crypto mining, if you saw it really briefly, and this is a 5-minute window of CloudWatch. So remember, we enabled CloudWatch at the very beginning of the setup here. So the 5-minute window, now you can see my CPU is almost up to 70%. So what does this mean to you? It means that you're paying my bill. I'm not paying anything here. I'm basically gaining money on the back end while you are footing the power and the consumption bill for AWS.
I wonder how much money you could actually get out of this.
Yeah, let's take a look.
Yeah, this is why we're getting it. Let's switch back over to the presentation, please.
So this is interesting. So this is actually following the wallet that was actually delivered to my vulnerable Drupal instance. So for Monero, it's a little bit harder to say overall how much money was made, because it's designed for not being able to be truly visible. But this is the hash rate. So we can imply the amount of money that was being made by this adversary just by the hash rate at that single jump. So remember on our slide before, the timeline where we showed about April 18th or so is when the actual vulnerability was public knowledge and being triggered across the internet? You have this large spike. That is literally the large spike of the adversary automating the delivery of the crypto mining binary. Then the actual aftermath was the estimated amount of cash that person would make was about $2,000 per month from just that single exploitation, basically, playbook that they had written. What's even taken further into context here, because you can generate multiple wallets, this is one wallet of one resource that I have. There could have been many other resources out there that have been compromised that are all delivering the same amount of money to this user.
That sounds like free money to me.
Well, it's free money because you're not paying for CPU, you're not paying for power. So basically, if you can see, my calculation here says there's no cost associated with it. It is completely free for the adversary.
So what if I could combine all these things we've been talking about? So we wanted to take an example of combining a botnet activity with ransomware, with coin mining, a Unit 42 blog post they just put together a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, so this is a really good example. Again, recently published. You can go read it on our blog right now. This is xbash. Xbash would take into context where it lands. Once I perform the exploitation, I've been able to gain access to the resource itself. I'll take parallel paths depending on what actual OS type we have. So Windows, I'll generate a crypto mining binary, deliver it, and mine cryptocurrency with that actual resource. Also, at the same time, it had a built-in capability of using scanning capabilities internally to find potentially other resources to infect. Because again, if I have the binary living inside of your environment, it's very easy for me to transplant that binary somewhere else and begin crypto mining on 20 machines.
Nothing like
machines.
the lateral movement to be able to take advantage of that.
Exactly, exactly. And in the context of the Linux device, if it lands on a Linux server, sees certain iterations of database software installed, like Redis or Elastic or something along those lines, it will actually delete the database if it has the capabilities to do so, so meaning the permissions weren't set properly. Delete the database, leave behind a ransom message saying, oh, by the way, if you want your database back, you need to pay this Bitcoin wallet, or this Monero wallet in some cases. And then, in the context of actually you paid the ransom, can you guess what wouldn't happen? You wouldn't get your database back.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't actually an encryption process. They just deleted it.
So a lot of things are coming to mind. I'm thinking network segmentation. I'm thinking vulnerability protection. I'm thinking file blocking.
Yep.
There's so many things. So where did these attacks really focus?
So this was interesting. So last week, we're like, I wonder if we can find databases worldwide that actually have this string. So it leaves behind a unique string that says, I've encrypted your database, please pay this wallet. So when we looked at that string in Shodan, which obviously everyone probably knows and loves, hopefully, there's a unique aspect here. If you notice, 95% of what you see up here is European-based.
Yeah,
Netherlands being #1 for the amount of actually encrypted databases, or shall we say deleted databases, not encrypted, that are actually publicly accessible. And if you combine that with the actual top organizations, you'll notice that a large percentage of those are hosting providers.
So we see the Netherlands, we see France is #2, UK is #4, Turkey #6. That's a lot of EMEA organizations right there.
Absolutely.
So let's keep going on the best practices there. We talked about file blocking. So being able to prevent ELF files or any other file types that should or should not be allowed to come in and out of the environment. So block unexpected files from coming in from untrusted sources. Being able to alert on all visibility. You know, one of the things that we talk about, if an adversary does get in your data center, when they're exfiltrating the data, putting in an encrypted RAR file, that may be the only indicator that you have that data is leaving. So have as much visibility of what's coming in, coming out for all file types that are down. And then have allow actions to allow the server updates and patch management, yum and apt-get, with the caveat to make sure it's only restricted to particular times or this particular servers. Otherwise, the adversary may use the same infrastructure. The other best practice, how many of you have heard of MindMeld? All right, excellent. So we created MindMeld to be able to help you take third-party threat intel indicators from threat intelligence feeds, public feeds, private feeds, threat intelligence platforms, aggregate them, deduplicate, and push them into enforcement, into threat prevention platforms, network enforcers, into your SIEMs, into endpoints. And that's one of the things. There's so often that people read great threat intelligence or blog posts about particular adversaries, and every time I go ask them, so what did you do with the indicators, the 40 pages of the indicators, in the back of the report? The answer was, we didn't do anything. So we want you to be able to automate taking those indicators and do as much prevention as possible. So Erik, you've got a great example of something you deployed in your environment.
Yeah, so this is actually my home, protecting my wife and my 2 children. I have 30 different open source miners, one being, I'll give you because I'm top level examples, the SANS D-Shield top 20 attacking IP ranges, ransomware tracker, which tracks IPs, URLs, domains associated with ransomware delivery as well as communication, as well as a few others like OpenFish, which tracks known phishing URLs. All those are being streamlined as blocking rules within my firewall at home. And what that really means is at top level, I have blocking rules that disallow traffic from any of the originating or already known bad items within these type of third-party feeds, which then reduces the number of actual IPS or vulnerability alerts that I receive. Because the reality is I'm being dropping based upon my policy, doesn't even require me to go any further.
Yeah. So so quick question. How many of you have external dynamic lists configured in your environment today? Okay. So this is one of the things that you can really reduce the attack surface, prevent known bad attacks from coming in. So what I did here is I set up 2 rules. In PAN-OS 8.0, we had 2 predefined IP block lists. So this is the known malicious IP feed. I have an inbound as well as an outbound. And then I only took 3 of the 30. I took the SANS Internet Storm Center, malicious domains, and the brute force blocker, both inbound and outbound. I deployed this with one of our customers in alert mode. And after 1 week, 3.8 million attacks would have been stopped with just the first rule. And on the third rule, 132 million attacks would have been stopped. That's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And again, it's the precursor of the attacks. So just think of how many vulnerability attempts or how many SQL injection, cross-site scripting are the other bad things that are coming from those IPs that we saw in some of the honeypot deployed systems. So this is absolutely a really fantastic thing. So just in summary again, inbound EDL, outbound EDL, limit file types, antivirus, tie together wildfire. This is really fantastic to be able to use. So let's flip over and talk about web shells real quick.
Yeah, so how many people here are familiar with web shells? Raise your hand. Have you ever heard of them, seen them? I'll give you one anecdotal situation I saw at a customer. I actually was demonstrating a web shell for a SOC, and I was showing them some of the features, and one of the SOC analysts piped up and said, oh, you know what's really interesting? I've actually seen that in my environment. Like, oh, really? Like, so what did you find out about that web shell that was delivered? Like, oh, actually, we just removed it. And if you don't understand the context here, if you think about just removing something, you're not fixing how it actually arrived at the actual web server tier. So to show you what a demonstration of a web shell, I'm going to follow the exact same attack workflow I set up before, triggering the Drupal vulnerability. The other aspect here, I'm going to push in a file. That single file, in this case, is PHP-based. They're ASP-based. There are other different scripting languages. It gives me the capability of basically acting as a person at a shell, but through a standard HTTP GET request. So literally here, you can see I can move my way through the entire OS, change directories, pull down different configuration files, et cetera. But I also have the capability in this web shell specifically, which is WSO, which is very popular. I can then brute force my way backwards through the environment. So think about this. I'm sitting at the web tier level. You have a database tier, probably an application tier, other pieces surrounding it. I'm basically now using that resource to work my way backwards through your environment, which I can guarantee, probably of everyone in this room, I can guarantee your data center segmentation profiles typically allow everything from the data center into the user environment. But maybe, there's some type of rules that only allow certain user traffic back. So it's a way of me working my way back through the environment from basically the front door into the resources I'm looking for.
So this sounds like a pretty good back door for you to be able to leverage to do anything you want.
Yeah, and funny enough, just to make another slight jab at that original AWS instance, if I actually look at the database configuration, so I'm going to do, after I do this single brute force, which will complete very fast because it's running, again, with the CPU resources of the web server itself, I'm going to actually view the configuration file that tells me what the username and password is for the database. Because in this AWS instance, it's poorly configured. So if I ask and say, just show me what the username and password is, can you guess what the username and password is for the database? It is root and no password.
Yikes. No, I know none of you would ever do that. Maybe the DevOps guy? No. Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully no one does something like that. But again, web shells, the US CERT put out a really good advisory in 2016. So it's one of those things that we wanted to highlight here is just one more example of having that, the backdoor put on the server resources. We've been adding a lot of protections around web shells for detecting the C2 communications of those.
Yeah, in the context also, if you look at the protections we have, we think about that automated security action. So being able to take a single IPS event being triggered on basically any server resource or any resource within your environment, and being able to then build an actual rule to say quarantine the offending client.
Should we switch over to the
I'll show you the other
again?
video in a second.
But no, switch over to the slides. So I think we've got, so here we talked about, again, what you're doing with your logs. Probably one of the most boring things around, but logs are exciting because that's what you want to do if you have a web shell C2 spyware event in your logs. You want to take a particular action. If you have a vulnerability trigger, you want to do things like the granular log forwarding, the HTTP log forwarding, the auto tagging that we showed you together, HTTP log forwarding to Slack, HTTP log forwarding to MindMeld, being able to go to Twilio, Blacklist, Aruba, access points, things like that. There's so many things. Again, you're here at Ignite. Learn about the automated actions you can do with log forwarding. There's a lot of cool things.
Yeah, in this example, even if you take even 2 steps further, if I say, I see a web shell being accessed on a web server, which means there's some vulnerability that's been triggered. Let's say it's an unknown vulnerability, never been seen before in the wild. If I see the web shell access, I can kick off a routine that, again, quarantines the offending source of the client requests, then also notify the DevOps team that, hey, we've seen a web shell on this particular web server via ServiceNow ticket or something else, Jira, for example. So they're notified that something's happening. We've stopped the actual attack from taking place. At the same time, we have all the surrounding information to understand where the web shell is actually on the web server itself as well.
Yeah. The other aspect, kicking off a ServiceNow ticket. So that's the help desk, kicking up the IR workflow. But with some of the other tools, hopefully you're hearing about Magnifier and really looking at this. As some of the attack techniques that we've talked about, you only will be able to find the attackers that are doing reconnaissance, doing lateral movement, and doing exfiltration with Magnifier. So please take advantage of learning everything you can about that. Quick show of hands. How many of you pay attention to port scans in your logs? Yeah, OK. Again, Magnifier is one of the tools that will be able to allow you to help you identify things. So let's do a quick demo, and we're almost wrapped up here, folks.
Yeah, so this is an example. So basically, I use the auto-tagging example here. Again, similar profile we set up before with the external Drupal access. I have the very specific vulnerability profiles applied,
So we
which
have a
are then
strict
going
spyware
to, in
policy.
the end, once we see the actual request coming in, that's going to generate that PHP web shell access IPS vulnerability log. It's going to then move the offending client IP directly into a quarantine.
So we've got all the log forwarding rules set up here.
Yep. So I'm forwarding in my home environment to Elastic as well as a Splunk. So I have bidirectional delivery of the actual events themselves. Any which of the two can actually push information back into a DAG on the firewall itself. But it's a really good example of all the flexibility you have. Again, delivering the logs in two different places. One example would be to go to ServiceNow or some other syslog source or whatever it may be. But the reality is, in the end, what we want to do is essentially quarantine the device.
So we're quarantining that, kicking off the event. Again, I've got threat ID equals PHP web shell access. So we'll actually see the events here.
Yeah, and the way I'd mimic this at home, I actually had multiple different external IPs that were just generating tons and tons of traffic coming into my environment that were triggering that web shell. So basically, as that took place, every single new IP that was generating an HTTP GET request to that specific web shell or triggering the vulnerability alert, they would automatically be placed in the quarantine group across, again, my entire environment, because this was a panoramic configuration.
And so there's all the vulnerability, the PHP web shell access there. So again, that would have triggered the quarantine action based on that. So in summary here, we've got, switch back over to the slides, please. We did the strict spyware policy, magnifier for lateral movement, exfil, and recon, the automated security action. Really, really powerful things. So quick summary to wrap up, folks. Any of you watch Mr. Robot? OK, I've got my favorite quote out of Mr. Robot. The world is a dangerous place, Elliot, not because of those who do evil, but because those of you who look on and do nothing. We want you to do something, and that's one of the key things here. Visibility and prevention. Rob Joyce, Chief Tailored Access Operations. If you want to protect your network, you need to know what's on your protected. So this is one of the key things that we really believe. And so the call to action here is really implement consistency. Same policies, visibility, whether it's cloud, public cloud, private cloud, internet gateway, data center, having that visibility and control is absolutely paramount. So visibility, make it simple, take care of the automated operations, and prevention, prevention, prevention. You really can't say that enough. Anything else to add?
Not at all. I know we're way over our time already.
OK, yeah, so some other fantastic sessions. So stay here for Mandeep and Arun's session talking about Internet Security Gateway, preventing known threats, command and control with Martin Walter, cryptocurrency, fantastic session, stopping the breach without stopping the business. So Susie Van Patten's going to do a real deep dive in tuning vulnerability, spyware profiles, and really helping you get reports and visibility, wildfire and threat prevention, and best practices for threat updates. We're going to stick around here for questions afterwards. Eric, any last things?
We'll also be at the exhibition hall directly after this, presenting in the big round central point with all the threat prevention features. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to either ask them now or ask them later as we're standing around the booth.
All right, thanks very much, folks.
Thanks so much, everyone.